Shalom and welcome to the Gospel according to Moses, Exodus, Lesson 2. You just was listening to Hatekva, which is the Israeli national anthem, and Hatekva means hope. And since we're focusing in on Exodus, we're focusing in on what the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, Adonai Yeshua, the Lord God did for Israel. Not only is God the hope of Israel, He is the hope for all mankind. And so I play that as we continue our lessons in the book of Exodus in the Torah series called the Gospel according to Moses. Now, Torah is a word that's commonly used to indicate the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's also known as the Pentateuch, or the 5 books, or the books of Moses. Now, you know, or many of you know, that the series has already started in Genesis. At this time here, we're well into Genesis. The last lesson I did was the beginning of Genesis chapter 12. So you can go to the website, which is lightofmenorah.org, all one word, MENORAH, lightofmenorah.org. And in the right-hand corner, you'll see a search window. So if you wanted to either find the latest lesson in the Genesis study, or if indeed you'd like to begin also the Genesis study as we're studying Torah, just put in these 3 words in the search window: Gospel, Moses, Genesis. Put those 3 words in and search, and you'll come up with all the lessons in the Torah series, the Gospel according to Moses, for the book of Genesis. So let's continue our study of the book of Exodus. In lesson 1, we got up to verse 7 or 8. And so I'm going to continue reading in the book of Exodus, chapter 1, starting in verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply. And in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land." So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor, in mortar and bricks, and in all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed upon them. The question always is, did the Exodus actually happen? There is a date that is, commonly used among Christians, that the Exodus actually happened in 1446 BC, or BC, or that's the year Moses would have led Israel out of Egypt, 1446 BC. Now, many of you probably heard of that date, and many accept the date of 1446 BC, but they don't have any proof. They've never been given any proof. You'll hear it in sermons with no proof. You'll hear it in Bible studies with no proof. You'll read it in books, and they don't prove it. Now, in this study, we are going to prove it unequivocally. There will be no doubt. It'll be crystal clear that 1446 BC is probably the likely date when Moses led Israel out of Egypt. Now, we're going to come back to that. We'll come back to a lesson, probably a whole lesson, devoted to 1446 BC. So please hang on to that. As I told you in lesson 1, also hang on to the phrase that the sons of Jacob also means the sons of Israel. The sons of Israel, the sons of Jacob, because Israel is Jacob's other name. A couple of things to remember. But for now, I'm asking you to assume that the 1446 date is the date when Moses led Israel out of Egypt. If that's the case, we know in the Bible it says that Moses was 80 years old when he led them out of Egypt, which means Moses was born in 1526 BC. All you need to do is take 1446 and add 80, and you come up with 1526. Now, just prior to Moses' birth, 20, 30, 40 years, something like that, the Semitic people called the Hyksos. These were northern invaders into Egypt. They were Semitic. They were not Hebrew. And I invite you to go to the website, a fantastic website. It's called the Ancient History Encyclopedia. You can type that into your search window, Ancient History Encyclopedia, and then also add the word in Hyksos, Hyksos, and you'll get a lot of information on the Hyksos, who they were, when they invaded Egypt, when they were defeated, and so on. Now, they were defeated by the Egyptians in and around the area or era of 1570 BC. So you can see this is really close to when Moses was born in 1526. This is normally called the beginning of the New Kingdom. The Exodus, whether some of you believe in the late date or the early date, makes no difference. It happened in the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom. And this is, 1570 BC, is the beginning of the 18th dynasty in the new kingdom of Egypt. So indeed, this is about 44 years before Moses' birth. So these Hyksos basically ruled Lower Egypt. Now, Lower Egypt is what we would call Northern Egypt. It's called Lower Egypt because the Nile River, and when you study Egypt, everything's the Nile. You study the Nile, that's Egypt. The Nile is higher the further south you go into Africa. And so the water is coming down from the higher places to the lower places. And so finally, when you get to Cairo and you get to the Nile Delta, this is Lower Egypt. So the Nile is obviously flowing from the south to the north, from its higher places to its lower places. So the northern part of Egypt is called Lower Egypt. Now, the Hyksos controlled this area. We'd call it Northern Egypt or Lower Egypt. And they controlled it from a city called Abydos. And Abydos, as an ancient city, was just north of ancient Thebes, which is modern Luxor. I'm going to say probably within 50 miles. So they ruled Egypt, the Hyksos did, from Abydos. I'm pretty sure it's Abydos. From there to the Mediterranean Sea for about 200 years, because they had pushed the Egyptians that far south. Now, there's a pharaoh. He is the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. He is the first pharaoh of the New Kingdom. He comes to power, and he is the one that actually defeated the Hyksos. His name is Ahmoses the First. Now, his Egyptian name, a lot of different ways of pronouncing it, could be La Mesu. La is the name of the moon god, and Mesu, or Moses, means brought forth or was born through. So La Mesu, Moses, means that this pharaoh was brought forth by the moon god, that his birth is attributed to the moon god of the Egyptians. Now, he's the pharaoh when Moses, is born. And just as an aside, Moses is not a Hebrew name. Moses is the English for the Hebrew Moshe, but Moshe is the Hebrew for Mesu. Now, I'm trying to pronounce the Egyptian for you as best as I can, and I think Mesu is pretty close. So Moses' name is Egyptian. It is not Hebrew, though we do have a Hebrew equivalent, obviously, in the Bible. So, coming back, Moses the first, he who was brought forth by the moon god of the Egyptians, Moses the first, he defeats the Semitic enemy. They were Semites. Enemy, the Hyksos. Now, when you go to verse 8, we just read, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, what's fascinating is, Albert Barnes, in his fantastic Bible commentary, he says this is a really interesting phrase to describe a new king. Normally, it would say there was a new king in Egypt, not arose over Egypt. As Albert Barnes comments, that it seems as if this is a new Egyptian king, where prior to that there were no Egyptian kings. He said, second of all, saying that a new king arose over Egypt gives the impression, or it implies, that the normal transference of power from one king to the next, from one pharaoh to the next, was interrupted. And indeed, Albert Barnes, back in the 1800s, he said, this fits Pharaoh Moses I perfectly. And we just came up with it through the 1446 date. Fascinatingly enough, Barnes comes at it from looking at and studying the pharaohs. He knows that Moses I was the one who defeated the Hyksos. He is a new king that arose over Egypt, a new Egyptian king. He was not a Semite. He was purely Egyptian. We're coming at it from the date 1446 BC. Like I said, we will prove that date, 1446 BC, is a realistic and credible date for the Exodus. Now, Moses I probably defeated the Hyksos by stealing their technology, because the Hyksos had chariots. When they came in 200 years prior to that, the Egyptians did not have chariots. They had carts, but not war chariots. Now, Moses I, he secures the borders of Egypt, expands Egypt. Makes sense, because now he was in Thebes, south of Abydos. And now that he's defeated the Hyksos, he's pushing his way all the way through areas past Abydos, past the ancient city of Memphis, which is right below or south of the modern city of Cairo, and directly into the Nile Delta. So again, he's expanding the borders of Egypt. And all of this history fits the Bible. Moses I was probably very leery of Semites. Now, this is understandable. He just defeated the northern barbarians who came in for 200 years and took over half of Egypt. They were Semites. And now he's got all these Semites living among the Egyptians that are called the Hebrews. Let's take a look at verse 10. In verse 10 we read, "Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the field." Yes, he's thinking these Semites, these Hebrews, are going to join themselves to the Semites, the Hyksos, that they just defeated and pushed out. So Moses I is probably very suspicious of the Hebrews, and it would seem likely that he would gather the Hebrews and make them slaves, gather them into, call them slave prisons, call them slave camps. He probably regathered them into the Nile Delta around the Goshen area. Now, the reason why I bring this up, that he regathered them, in verse 7 of Exodus 1, we read, "But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them." Now, the impression here from Bible scholars is this is not the land of Goshen. This is not the area where Jacob settled at first when he came in. This is the land. This is all of the land of Egypt, all the way from the Nile Delta down to the first cataracts. So it's likely the Hebrews, they moved out of Goshen over time. I mean, they had it really good at the time of Joseph, and probably for many years after that. They probably assimilated into the culture. Now, this is another topic that we will be dealing with in a very short period of time to show that the Hebrews actually did assimilate into the Egyptian culture. And probably that at the time of Joseph, and more than likely after the time of Joseph, after he died, the Hebrews probably got involved, obviously, into the culture, and they took on new jobs and learned new skills. Now, it's very interesting. They needed these skills, and God knew that they needed these skills to build God's Mishkan HaKodesh, his holy dwelling place, his holy dwelling tent that we know as the tabernacle. Now, you'll remember this when we go to Exodus 31, verses 1 through 6. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, and the son of Hur, the tribe of Judah. I have filled him with the Spirit of God and wisdom and understanding and knowledge and in all kinds of craftsmanship, to make artistic designs for work in gold and silver and in bronze, and in the cutting of stones for settings, and in the carving of wood, that he may work in all kinds of craftsmanship. And behold, I myself have appointed him with Oholiav, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan. And in the hearts of all who are skillful I have put skill, that they may make all that I have commanded you." So, where did they get the skills at? They got them in Egypt. It only makes sense. God was using this time to actually have his people trained for the new jobs and the new skills that they would need in building the tabernacle of the Lord. Here's another verse, and this is Exodus 36, 1 through 2. "Now, Bezalel and Oholiav and every skillful person." No, it doesn't say every skillful man. It says every skillful person, "in whom the Lord has put skill and understanding to know how to perform all the work and the construction of the sanctuary, shall perform in accordance with all that the Lord has commanded." Then Moses called Bezalel and Oholiav and every skillful person, but more than likely men and women. Little did they know, can you imagine, what the Lord was going to have them do later on. Now this speaks to me today. It speaks to me, and I think it speaks to all of us today in our lives. We don't know his ways or his plans. Now for me, I have to say that this has been so true in my work in teaching Bible over all of these years. I remember when I first started, there was no such thing as laptop computers, no such thing as PowerPoint, no such thing as the internet. And as all of that grew, little did I know that all the skills with regards to PowerPoint, with regards to laptop computers, with respect to teaching adults, and being, little did I know that my professional career and my jobs and so on was actually enhancing all the things that I'm doing today. I didn't know then what God's plans were or his ways. Now we know his word, that our ways and our lives are designed by him. So little do we know now what God is doing for us in the future. He probably has special tasks for us. He might have special jobs for us. He may have one particular person in mind that we are supposed to work with to help them find salvation in Jesus. Just like Bezalel and Holiav and all the Hebrews. So remember this in Psalm 37. This is in starting in verse 23. Steps of a man are designed by the Lord, they're directed by God, and he delights in our way. And even if we fall face down, even if we fail, we are not defeated in such a way that it's all over. We're not hurled headlong because he holds us up with his hand. And so here we have it. With regards to actually putting the Bible in its historical context, the Hebrews probably learned the skills needed that God wanted for the future. And by his Spirit, he actually directed them into jobs as they assimilated into the Egyptian culture for the future of his tabernacle, to dwell among his people. So anyway, we return to Moses the first. He's got to control these Semites. They're throughout the land. They're all among the Egyptians, perhaps intermarrying. He needs to put them in slave camps. He's got to gather them together. He needs to control them. So it seems likely that Moses the first, he's going to bring them back to the Goshen area. He's going to bring them back to that one area in what we will call northern Egypt or lower Egypt. Put them in the slave camps, enslave them. And their lives turned to be very, very difficult under cruel conditions. What's a little eerie is this happened to them again. When you read about the Jewish people in Germany prior to World War II, you read about the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. The Nazis also gathered the Jews together because they had assimilated into the German culture. Some Jews even changed their names so it didn't sound Jewish. It didn't matter. They gathered them into ghettos. They gathered them into camps. They enslaved them. They brutalized them. And killed over 6 million. It's very eerie. But now we take a look at this and we say, this is amazing. If 1446 BC is the correct date when Moses led Israel out of Egypt, and it is, and like I said, we'll be taking a look at that. This all fits the events of everything we've read here in Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. And Albert Barnes, back in the 1800s, who didn't have the archaeology, who didn't even know about the date of 1446 BC, he came up with the same conclusion. Now, it doesn't prove that the Exodus happened, but it shows the amazing reality of the Bible. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're reading already just in 14 verses, this ain't no legend. It's history. It's history, and it's the truth. I like to use John 8:31 through 32, where Jesus is talking about Jews who believed in him. And he said, if you're going to be truly my disciples, then you're going to abide or continue in my word. Problem is, the word there is not abide or continue. It really means to live our lives with his word as our foundation, our worldview. We're to endure in his word and persevere. And then we would know the truth, and the truth would set us free. Over and over and over again, we put the Bible back into its historical context, and the reality of His Word becomes so plain to us. Indeed, we see the truth of God's Word. And this is one of the goals of this course, whether you're studying Exodus or Genesis, and then later on with the other books. So let's continue. Starting in verse 15, then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, and let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing, and let the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, He established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. Now, if you listen to lesson 1 of the Gospel according to Moses' Exodus, you'd remember that one goal of the study is to study God's Word for its own sake. Again, going back to John 8:31 through 32 that I just mentioned, so that we would know the truth and the truth would set us free. Thus, we want to see how these lessons in Torah are applicable for us today. Now, today we face those who would gain power by fraud, actually cheating in the voting system. And some of them, with their worldview, would want to destroy the United States and make the Constitution of the United States null and void. We're in the midst of difficult days. So how can God's Word, written 3,400 years ago to a bunch of powerless slaves, help us? It's a good question. Malachi 3:6, I remember God says that He never changes, and neither does His Word. To me, this implies that His truth is truth for all time. His truth was truth then and now. It's just like putting the Bible into its historical context and understanding that the Hebrews, who assimilated into the Egyptian culture, probably took on all sorts of new jobs, turned away from their livelihood as shepherds and farmers, perhaps helped build pyramids or actually painting or writing, working in metal and in wood, developing all sorts of skills, actually directed by God for the future work that they would do to build His tabernacle. So indeed, let's see how His truth was not only truth then, but for now as well. Now, Pharaoh on Moses the first, though we are not given the Pharaoh's name here, which is important, he calls in the midwives. Now, most assume that the English in verse 15 is correct. Now, here's the verse. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. The Hebrew is Ve Yomer Melech Mitzrayim, La Mayal Ledot Ha Evirot. So to actually translate it exactly, it says, and spoke King Egypt to midwives the Hebrews. Now, in Hebrew, that can equally be translated this way. The king of Egypt spoke to the midwives of the Hebrews. Now, in the JPS Torah commentary, written by Nahum Sarnap, probably one of the key Jewish commentaries of the Torah. This phraseology, the Hebrew phrase, la mayal ledot ha-evirot, can either mean Hebrew wives or the midwives of the Hebrews. The latter is how it is understood by the Septuagint and by Josephus, as well as by Abravanel. Judah Hasid cites a tradition that they were Egyptians. However, the two names are Semitic. The point being here is there's an argument that the midwives were Egyptian. There's a strong argument that they're not Hebrew. First, you can say, well, wait a minute, their names are Hebrew. Shifra means brilliant or bright in the sense of like a brilliant star or a bright star. And Pua means glittering or sparkling. All right, those are Hebrew names. But Moses is writing to Hebrews. And he could probably have taken the Egyptian names of these two women and translated them into Hebrew. It's like the name Moses. When we actually look at the word Moses, you will find that it comes from the Hebrew name Moshe. But if you look at key scholarly resources, like for instance the JPS Torah commentary, or even the Chumash, which is the Orthodox Jewish commentary, or Christian scholars commenting on the Torah, they're going to tell you that Moses' name is Egyptian, probably pronounced Mesu. Now, the Bible uses the Hebrew translation. They do not state that his name was Mesu. Now, Mesu is a common word in Egypt, and it means brought forth or to be given birth by. So, for instance, Moses the first, Mesu, he's brought forth by the moon god Thutmoses, another pharaoh, a name of several pharaohs. Thutmoses, he's brought forth by the Egyptian god Thoth. And Thoth is the inventor of writing and also the great scribe of the sun god Ra. We talk about the pharaoh Ramses. It's Ra-Mesu. In other words, Ramses is Ra-Mesu. He is brought forth by the sun god Ra. And then we come to Moses, Hebrew Moshe, but actually his Hebrew name is Mesu, given to him by the daughter of Pharaoh. It means brought forth. Now, I find this interesting because it's not Yahweh Mesu or Yah Mesu, it's just Mesu. I'm not saying Yahweh because that is God's name. Yah is another short way that the Bible uses to indicate God's name. And we don't even that, we just have Mesu. Now, it's interesting to me. He's brought forth by God who is unknown to the Egyptians. The Egyptians don't know the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. They don't know the God of the Bible. They don't know the one true God. As far as they're concerned, he is the nameless one who brought forth Moses. The nameless one. Interesting. So, just because the midwives are presented to us with Hebrew names does not mean that they're Hebrew. It could very well be that Moses has just taken their Egyptian names and saying, well, in Hebrew, this is what they mean. So it's not an argument. In verse 16, we read, and he said, meaning the Pharaoh said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death, but if it is a daughter, then you shall live. Why does Pharaoh talk about the Hebrew women in the third person? Because if These are Hebrew midwives taking care of Hebrew women in birth. He doesn't have to talk about the Hebrew women in the third person. If he's talking to Hebrew midwives, he would say to them, and when you are helping the women give birth, there's no necessity for even bringing up the Hebrew women or even using the phrase Hebrew women in the third person. It makes sense then that these midwives could be Egyptian, because if he's talking to Egyptian midwives, they possibly help Egyptian women also. They're midwives, so they probably help Egyptian women during birth and Hebrew women. So it makes sense that if they're Egyptian, Pharaoh is saying to these Egyptian midwives, when you're helping not women, but the Hebrew women, to be very specific, that makes sense in the third person. So another verse to take a look at is verse 19. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. Now, the implication here in verse 19 is the midwives help Hebrew women in birth, but they're also probably helping Egyptian women also in birth. If they were just helping the Hebrew women in birth, there's no need to say the phrase Hebrew women in the third person. Another argument to say that Shiphrah and Puah are probably Egyptian is verse 18. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? We read all the way through verse 22. Nothing happens to them. No yelling, no threats, no punishment by Pharaoh. It only makes sense that if these were Hebrew women, they would have been punished somehow. But these are Egyptian midwives helping the Hebrew women. They are Pharaoh's people. And again, it adds to the concept that these midwives are Egyptian. In verse 17, we read, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. Now, when we go into this phrase that these midwives feared God, the Hebrew word there is Yareh. Strong's numbers H3372. And as a typical Hebrew word, it can have a meaning both in the positive and negative sense. In the negative sense, it would be to fear, to be afraid, to tremble. In the positive sense, it would mean to be in awe of, to revere, to highly respect. These midwives probably had a lot of contact with the religious Hebrew women. I mean, we already know that the Hebrews were throughout the land until perhaps Moses I had to gather them all together in slave camps. So indeed, it could very well be that they learned about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob. It seems probable. It seems probably they learned about the values of the one and only true God. Now we finally get to verse 22, and Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So all of a sudden we have a repeat of Pharaoh's command. And he's commanding his people. Who are Pharaoh's people? Egyptians, of course. So this is perhaps Pharaoh's command repeated. First he said it to the midwives, and now he's saying it again. In other words, you're going to continue the murder of the Hebrew boys. And so he's more than likely talking to Egyptian midwives. Now, think of this. God preserves the names of the midwives. He does not even bring up Pharaoh's name. But we know the names of the midwives, Shifra and Puah. We take a look at the JPS Torah commentary. Nahum Sarma recognizes this. And he says, the names of the midwives are recorded, but not those of the reigning pharaohs. In the biblical scale of values, those lowly champions of morality, Shifra and Puah, assume far greater historic importance than do the powerful tyrants who ruled Egypt. These two women take on a central great importance. They're the heroines of this story. They are the heroines in the book of Exodus. And the God of the Bible rewards them with Bayit. Strong's numbers H1004. And that can mean houses or households or prosperity. Whatever it might be, it was a good thing. And they were probably Egyptian. And all of a sudden, we have the first account of civil disobedience in the Bible. These two Egyptian women were in awe of God, not Pharaoh. They were brave, courageous. I like to use the Yiddish word, chutzpah. In the positive sense, chutzpah means boldness and daring in a good way. In short, these two women had guts. On top of that, this is just a thought of mine. I wonder if their names really were Shifra and Puah. Remember what their names meant. Shifra was brilliance, brightness, like a bright star or a brilliant star. Puah, glittering, shining. Perhaps Shifra and Puah are not their names. Perhaps God is teaching us that in the face of abject evil, the murder of baby boys, that these two women chose God's way. That these two women in Exodus 1 are shining examples. Examples of women who are just like the brightest stars. They're in awe of God, and they acted in such a way that they're glowing examples of godly women who were pagan then and for us now. For us today, they call out, Shifra and Puah call out to us from 3,400 years ago. I recall the early Christians in the pagan Roman Empire. This is going to be at the time probably of Paul or after, definitely after. They acted in reaction to the legal status of infanticide in their days. In Rome and in the pagan Roman society and the Greek Roman pagan society, those women could legally abort their baby, drown their babies, or abandon them. They would take them outside the city walls and abandon them, sometimes in manure piles or garbage piles. Baby dumps. They legally could do this. I have two articles on the website, www.lightofmenorah.org, that you find interesting with regards to the practice of infanticide in the Roman Empire and in the Greek Empire, that abortion was legal. Information on the early Christians who saved the abandoned ones. They saved the abandoned babies outside the city walls. They adopted them. They cared for them. Matter of fact, they even buried the ones that they took from the manure pile, the dung pile. And they buried them in their own cemeteries in the catacombs of Rome. I was going to lead a group of students to Greece, Turkey, and Rome, and I was going to take them to one catacomb. I'll give you the name of the catacomb. Praetextatus, Praetextatus. Praetextatus. And in there, you can actually visit the graves of little tiny babies who were saved because these Christians went out to the baby dumps outside the walls of Rome and saved them. Matter of fact, there's an inscription above the place where the bodies would have been buried in these niches in the wall. And it said, these are the graves. Now, pardon my word here, but this is exactly what it says. It says, these are the graves of the little shits. In other words, these are the babies that we saved from the dung pile, from the manure pile. This is our ancestors. This is our heritage. Those early Christians, they shine brilliantly amid an evil and dark time. And our ancestors are glittering, shining examples like Shifra and Pua. Now today, our times, we have some very difficult times. We're seeing men and women, whistleblowers, common people, having the guts, the courage, the chutzpah to stand up in the face of perhaps an election that's been stolen illegally from the American people. They're fighting the good fight to protect our country. Men and women. Saw some of them on TV the other day. I'd call them Shifra and Pua. Amidst the darkness and the evil and the lies and the fraud. For us, God is asking us to be like these two Egyptian midwives, the heroines of Exodus. God wants us to act on our faith with chutzpah, boldness and courage and bravery. It so happened in my preparation for this lesson, I did something strange. I actually created a map. And there is the Planned Parenthood clinic in a certain suburb of the Twin Cities. It doesn't do abortions. It's just a health clinic, Planned Parenthood health clinic, and they have abortion advice. But you can actually go to this clinic and therefore talk to their doctors and so on and be assigned to another clinic. I think there's 3 of them here in our area that actually do the abortions. But there are 20 churches surrounding this Planned Parenthood clinic in the southern suburb. 20 churches within 3 miles. And I thought, how cool. Now, this is just me. I don't know what's going on among these 20 churches. I don't know who's doing what in this suburb. But I was just thinking how cool it would be if all 20 churches united. It's just like the early Christians in Rome, united as one to save the babies from the manure pile. Can you imagine all 20 churches? They could be Lutheran. They could be Assemblies of God. They could be Pentecostal. They could be Messianic. But they all got together. And they say, okay, legally, we want to continue fighting the battle. But there are babies being murdered today. There are women going to this clinic and getting advice and being misled into the fact that their only recourse is to murder their child. We can't wait. Shifra and Pua didn't. Maybe the 20 churches they develop perhaps pre-abortion counseling centers just in their area. Make them locally available. Perhaps they would say, we provide free ultrasound. I already know that there's one Christian ministry that does this, but what about these churches right around Planned Parenthood? That they say, no, we're going to do this. We're going to fund it. We've got 2 places within blocks, and we did it. They put up signs, billboards, near the clinic and said, this advice is available here, just 2 blocks down, free ultrasound. Perhaps the 20 churches as one would be able to provide adoption advice and help and support, and I'm talking financial support, for the young pregnant women who perhaps see themselves with no other choice, but they do have that choice. Those billboards could shout out, learn all the options. Now again, perhaps things are already being done around that clinic. Perhaps in each of those churches there's a shifra and a pua, and many of them. So what are we to be like? We take a look at this lesson from 3,400 years ago approximately, and God is shouting out to us. Jesus said it precisely. What are we to be like? I go to Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Do you think the will of the Father is to keep babies in the womb alive and not murdered? Yes. Verse 21, it's not what you say about your faith, it's what you do. These are the very words of Jesus. Don't just say what you believe, show it. His brother James does the same thing in his letter. Then we go to Matthew 5, verses 14 through 16. You, I love this, you are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine, yes, let your light glitter, let your light sparkle, let your light be brilliant and bright. Shifra and Pua. Before all men in such a way that they see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So let your light shine today like Shifra and Pua. Shalom.